New York Harbor, 1942. The night is heavy with fog and fear. Ships creak at their moorings while the glow of the city flickers across the water like a dying pulse. The United States has just entered World War II, but already the enemy feels close, too close. Rumors of Nazi saboteurs moving through the dockyards have spread panic through the government. Explosions, fires, unexplained accidents, all hinting at an invisible hand. And somewhere deep within the walls of a New York prison, the man who might hold the key to saving America's harbor is not a soldier, not a spy, but a gangster. That man is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the architect of the American Mafia, once the most powerful figure in organized crime. At this moment in time, he's serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for running a prostitution racket, taken down by prosecutor Thomas Dewey. To the public, he's the symbol of moral decay. To the underworld, he's the invisible king. But to the desperate men in Washington and the Navy Intelligence Office, he is something else entirely, a potential ally. This opening moment unfolds like a paradox wrapped in smoke. America, fighting a war for freedom, is about to make a deal with its own devil. A deal born not out of loyalty but necessity. It's a story buried in classified files, whispered in dark corners and long denied by both sides. Yet, its echoes shaped the course of the war, and redefined what power really means in America. As the voice of history cuts through the silence of the docks, we see the impossible alliance take shape. An imprisoned mob boss negotiating with government agents. The Navy secretly courting the Mafia to secure the waterfront. It sounds like fiction, but this is the reality of Operation Underworld, a covert pact between organized crime and the United States government. This story isn't just about war or crime. It's about the gray space where patriotism and corruption meet. It's about the psychology of survival, of men who justify betrayal for the greater good, and others who mask ambition with the language of service. It's about how one man, locked in a cell, managed to reach beyond the prison walls and influence the fate of nations. The film of fog drifts over the harbor as we return to that fateful year. The Navy needs control of the docks to protect its supply lines. But those docks don't belong to the government, they belong to the Mafia. From the fishermen to the longshoremen, every rope, every crate, every cargo list is touched by the invisible network Luciano built years before. If spies are hiding among them, the government can't find them. But Lucky's people can. The question that hangs in the air is chilling. Can justice shake hands with crime and still call itself righteous? Can the American dream survive an alliance born in darkness? This is not just a story of wartime secrecy. It's a story about power, who wields it, who fears it, and who bends it to their will. It's about how Lucky Luciano, a man society condemned, became an unlikely savior when America needed its criminals most. Before this tale ends, we will see his rise from poverty to power, his imprisonment, his clandestine negotiations with the government, and his ultimate exile. But it all begins here, in the shadow of the harbor, where the fate of the nation and the legacy of the Mafia collided under the watchful eyes of both God and the law. A deal was made that night, one that would rewrite history, reshape the underworld, and blur forever the line between justice and sin. Before the storm of global war reached America's shores, the late 1930s were already a time of quiet unease. The Great Depression had left scars on every street corner. Breadlines stretched through neighborhoods, and desperation had become a silent companion to millions. In Europe, dark clouds gathered as Hitler's armies marched and Mussolini's fascists shouted promises of glory. The world was sliding toward chaos, and the United States, still licking its economic wounds, watched from across the ocean, hoping the storm might somehow pass it by. But at home, another war had already been fought, not with soldiers and tanks but with bullets and bribes. It was a war for control of America's underworld. Prohibition had ended, but the system it created didn't die with the repeal of the 18th Amendment. Instead, it evolved. The networks built to smuggle whiskey now trafficked heroin. The speakeasies became gambling dens. And the men who once hid in the shadows emerged as powerful businessmen, men like Lucky Luciano. New York City was the beating heart of this underground empire. The docks, the unions, the clubs, they were all arteries through which money and influence flowed. Politicians smiled in public and made deals in private. Police captains looked the other way. The underworld had learned something crucial from America's legitimate economy. Organization was power. The days of chaotic street gangs were fading. In their place rose a structure, efficient, disciplined, and ruthless. Yet, for all its apparent order, the world Luciano built was still fragile. The end of Prohibition had stripped the Mafia of its greatest profit source. New rackets, prostitution, narcotics, gambling, filled the void, but they brought new risks, new enemies, and new attention. Rival factions clashed. Old bosses disappeared. The Mafia was evolving faster than the law could understand it, and behind every newspaper headline was a story of betrayal, ambition, and reinvention. At the same time, the government's own house was in disarray. Corruption was rampant, law enforcement underfunded, and the FBI's focus narrow. J. Edgar Hoover publicly denied the existence of organized crime, calling it a myth, a dangerous illusion that let the real syndicates operate freely. It was a perfect environment for a man like Luciano. Invisible, intelligent, and already 3 steps ahead. But across the Atlantic, the ground was shifting. In Italy, Mussolini was cracking down on the Sicilian Mafia, branding them enemies of the fascist state. Many fled to America, bringing with them old loyalties and new grudges. On the docks of New York, whispers in Italian mixed with rumors of espionage. The lines between immigrant pride, criminal identity, and political loyalty began to blur. By 1939, the world teetered on the edge of war, and so did Luciano's empire. While he enjoyed the fruits of his criminal kingdom, the world around him grew increasingly unstable. The stock market trembled. Europe burned. The American people, weary of conflict, turned inward. But beneath the surface, another kind of conflict was simmering, one that would soon force the U.S. government and the underworld into the same desperate equation. Then came the moment that changed everything. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Overnight, America's isolation shattered. The country mobilized for total war, and New York Harbor, the same docks controlled by Luciano's network, became one of the most vital supply arteries for the Allied effort. Ammunition, weapons, food, everything that would sustain the war effort flowed through those waters. But the Mafia's hold on the waterfront was absolute. Without their cooperation, shipments could be delayed, stolen, or sabotaged. And then came the explosion, the burning of the French luxury liner Normandy at Pier 88 in 1942. Official reports blamed an accident, but rumors spread like wildfire. Nazi agents had struck New York. Panic gripped the Navy. Fear turned to desperation. That's when the unthinkable idea began to circulate in whispered meetings inside naval intelligence. What if the only way to protect America's ports was to make peace with the very men who controlled them? What if the key to defending the nation from foreign enemies lay in the hands of its own criminals? This was the world before the war fully consumed America. A world of shifting alliances, invisible empires, and blurred morals. The stage was set. The government would soon come face to face with the man who ruled New York's shadows. And in the crucible of fear and necessity, a secret pact would be born, one that would redefine both justice and power. As the winds of war howled overseas, the docks of Manhattan became the front line of a different kind of battle. Not between nations, but between the ideals of law and the reality of survival. It was in this world, fragile, divided, and desperate, that Lucky Luciano's influence would once again find its purpose. Before he became the architect of the American Mafia, before the suits, the silk ties, and the legend, Charles Lucky Luciano was just another immigrant kid scraping his way through the crowded streets of New York's Lower East Side. Born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, Sicily, he arrived in America at the age of 9 with nothing but a suitcase and a hunger for more. His family settled in a neighborhood where the air was thick with coal smoke, the buildings sagged with poverty, and every alley was a lesson in survival. The Lower East Side of the early 1900s was a crucible of ambition and crime. Immigrant families from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe packed into tenements, chasing dreams that rarely materialized. Honest work paid pennies, and respect was a luxury few could afford. In this world, toughness wasn't a choice, it was a language. Luciano learned it early. By the time he was 10, he was running errands for small-time crooks and watching older boys collect protection money from frightened shopkeepers. It was here, amid the chaos, that he first understood a truth that would guide his life. Power wasn't given, it was taken. As a teenager, Luciano joined local street gangs, quickly distinguishing himself not through violence, but through intelligence and charisma. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he had something far more dangerous: the ability to organize. While other kids brawled for scraps, he built networks, forming connections with Jewish and Irish gangs who controlled different corners of the city. Among his closest friends was a sharp-minded Jewish kid named Meyer Lansky, a partnership that would later reshape the entire underworld. Together, they realized something revolutionary for their time. Crime didn't need to be divided by ethnicity, it could be managed like a business. Luciano's rise through the underworld was marked by an uncanny blend of pragmatism and ruthlessness. He didn't believe in the old Sicilian codes that tied men to blood feuds and outdated traditions. To him, the Mafia was not about honor, it was about opportunity. That rejection of the old world made him dangerous to the old bosses, but irresistible to the new generation of gangsters who saw crime as enterprise, not family. The Prohibition era arrived like a divine gift. When the U.S. government outlawed alcohol in 1920, Luciano and his associates saw the single greatest business opportunity in criminal history. Smuggling liquor became a billion-dollar industry overnight, and Luciano, with Lansky and another fiery young gangster named Bugsy Siegel, turned the chaos into a coordinated operation. He forged alliances with bootleggers, bribed officials, and used the docks, the same ones he would later control, as arteries for smuggling. But success demanded blood. The streets of New York erupted in turf wars, betrayals, and assassinations. Luciano navigated it all with cold precision, playing rivals against one another while quietly building influence. He had learned how to survive by being adaptable, loyal only to profit and survival. His defining moment came during the brutal Castellamarese War, a mafia civil war that tore New York apart between 1929 and 1931. Old World traditionalists, led by Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, fought for dominance. Luciano, initially Masuria's protégé, saw both men as relics. He plotted a new future, one free from the old hierarchies that chained the Mafia to Sicily's feuds. The young gangster made a decision that would forever alter the underworld. He orchestrated the murders of both Masuria and Maranzano, ending the war and positioning himself as the unchallenged power behind a new system. He called it the Commission, a governing body for organized crime that would settle disputes, manage territories, and ensure profits flowed without chaos. It was a concept borrowed from corporate America, and it worked. Luciano had turned murder into management. By his mid-30s he was untouchable. Politicians courted him in secret, nightclubs welcomed him like royalty, and newspapers whispered his name with fear and fascination. He had transcended the stereotype of the crude gangster. He was now a businessman of crime, a strategist who understood that control didn't come from bullets alone. It came from structure, from respect, from the illusion of legitimacy. Psychologically, Luciano represented a new kind of criminal mind, one unbound by morality yet disciplined by logic. He didn't kill for pride, he killed for efficiency. He didn't seek to terrify, he sought to control. To his associates he was charismatic and decisive. To his enemies he was invisible until the moment they ceased to exist. And to himself he was something in between, part outlaw, part entrepreneur, and part philosopher of power. But even as his empire expanded, the seeds of his downfall were being planted. His openness, his willingness to mix business with anyone who could make money, earned him enemies both within and outside the Mafia. The old dons resented his modern methods. The law, humiliated by his arrogance, began to circle like vultures. Still, for a moment in history, Luciano stood above them all, a self-made king born from the gutter. He had conquered the underworld, mastered the art of organization, and created a criminal network so efficient that it mirrored the very nation it defied. The boy from the slums had risen to power not through luck, but through vision. And yet, it was that same ambition that would soon bring the entire weight of the law down upon him. His empire was vast, his influence unmatched, but in the shadows of success, the first cracks were beginning to form. The next chapter of his life would no longer be about how he rose, but how far he could fall. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had done the unthinkable. He had taken the bloody chaos of the criminal underworld and turned it into an empire of order. The Castellamarese War had left New York's Mafia in ruins, but from its ashes, Luciano built something new, something visionary. For the first time in American history, organized crime was no longer a collection of feuding gangs. It was a system, a hierarchy, a government of crime. The old world had fallen. The days of Sicilian mustache Petes, men bound by ancient codes and regional loyalties, were over. Luciano saw them as fossils, clinging to rituals that made them predictable and weak. He respected tradition but not when it stood in the way of progress. His revolution was simple: to run the Mafia like a corporation with efficiency, structure, and profit as its guiding principles. He began by reorganizing the 5 families, the foundation of modern organized crime in New York. Each family would control its own territory, its own business interests, and its own soldiers, but all would answer to a central council, the Commission. This governing body, composed of the bosses of the major families, would resolve disputes, divide profits, and maintain peace. No more wars that drained money and drew public attention. No more blind allegiance to one man. The Mafia would be governed by consensus just like a board of directors. Luciano positioned himself not as a dictator, but as the quiet power behind the scenes, the chairman of the board, so to speak. He understood that true control didn't come from demanding loyalty, it came from designing a system where loyalty became self-interest. Every member of the commission had something to gain by maintaining order. And in that elegant balance of fear and profit, Luciano found his genius. His inner circle was just as visionary. Meyer Lansky, his lifelong friend and financial strategist, was the brains behind the numbers. Lansky brought structure to the finances, laundering dirty money through legitimate fronts and investments. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, handled the political connections, greasing palms from City Hall to Albany. Bugsy Siegel, volatile and ambitious, enforced Luciano's will on the streets and dreamed of bigger things to come, dreams that would one day give birth to Las Vegas. Together, they formed a criminal syndicate unlike anything America had ever seen. It wasn't just about bootlegging or gambling anymore, it was about diversification. Labor unions, construction companies, nightclubs, and even the garment industry fell under their influence. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to blur the line between legal and illegal, between respectability and corruption. He made crime look civilized. But the heart of Luciano's power was his ability to think like a businessman in a world of gangsters. He understood branding before the term existed. He gave organized crime a face that looked less like a thug's and more like an executive's. He wore tailored suits, attended Broadway premieres, and mingled with the elite of New York society. The newspapers called him charming, polished, and dangerous. He didn't just dominate the underworld, he seduced the overground. Underneath that glamour, however, lay a carefully maintained psychology of fear. Luciano's rule depended on stability, and stability required ruthless enforcement. Betrayal, inefficiency, or disobedience were punished swiftly and invisibly. One moment a man could be running a profitable racket, the next he could vanish into the East River. Luciano believed in discipline, not as cruelty but as necessity. In his mind, fear wasn't just a weapon, it was management. What made him even more dangerous was his understanding of politics. Luciano knew that crime could only survive if it coexisted with power. He made deals with police captains, bribed judges, and financed politicians. He treated corruption not as a risk but as an investment. Frank Costello became his key conduit, turning political influence into protection. The Mafia no longer fought the system, it quietly became part of it. Psychologically, Luciano was a paradox, cold yet personable, pragmatic yet visionary. He could order a man's death with the same calm he used to plan a business merger. Yet, those who met him often described him as magnetic, a man who spoke softly but radiated authority. He had the rare ability to make his subordinates feel important, even while reminding them that they were expendable. His control wasn't built on shouting or threats, but on quiet inevitability, the kind of authority that didn't need to prove itself. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's transformation of the Mafia was complete. He had turned gang warfare into corporate governance, street rackets into national syndicates, and thuggery into empire. He was no longer just a mobster, he was a pioneer of organized systems. A criminal architect whose model of power would influence not only future mob bosses, but politicians, corporations, and intelligence agencies alike. But with structure came visibility. The cleaner the Mafia looked, the more it drew attention from those who once ignored it. The politicians who shook his hand now whispered his name in fear. The newspapers that once glamorized him began to demand justice. And in the shadows, a new kind of adversary was waiting. A young prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey who believed that no man, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Luciano's empire had reached its golden age, gleaming with wealth and influence. But like every empire built on corruption and secrecy, it carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. His system was perfect, until the day the system turned on him. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had achieved what no gangster before him had even dared to dream. He had transformed organized crime from a network of bloody street feuds into a disciplined empire. His creation, the Commission, operated like a Fortune 500 company, with departments, investments, and intercity partnerships. But behind its polished facade lay a machine powered by vice, gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and labor racketeering. These weren't crimes to Luciano, they were industries. And he ran them with the same efficiency as any Wall Street executive. Luciano believed in one unshakable principle: crime could be civilized, could be standardized, managed, and scaled like any other business. Under his direction, the Mafia expanded far beyond bootlegging. He developed a model built on three pillars: control, profit, and invisibility. Each racket fed into the next, creating a web of dependency that made him indispensable to everyone who touched it, from the lowest dockworker to the highest politician. Prostitution was among his most lucrative ventures. Luciano understood that vice would always find customers, and he treated it with the same pragmatism as any supply and demand business. He used union structures, bookkeepers, and brokers to manage brothels as though they were legitimate enterprises. Prostitutes paid dues, madams operated under contracts, and every dollar was accounted for. It was the first true corporate sex trade in America, and it made him millions. But his ambition didn't stop there. Gambling, both legal and illegal, became another cornerstone of his empire. From Harlem's policy games to plush midtown casinos, Luciano's reach extended across state lines. He created a national gambling syndicate that funneled money into his network of loyal lieutenants. Every game was taxed, every winner recorded, and every piece of profit funneled back into the commission's coffers. Through his partnerships with Lansky and Siegel, Luciano built a criminal economy that operated in parallel to America's legitimate one: cleaner, faster, and often more reliable. Labor racketeering was where Luciano's brilliance truly shone. He saw what few others did: that real power in New York didn't lie in the streets, but in the docks and unions. Whoever controlled the men who moved the city's goods controlled the city itself. By infiltrating labor unions, especially the International Longshoremen's Association, Luciano ensured that no cargo left or arrived in New York without his approval. He could halt shipments, influence strikes, and even manipulate wartime production. The Mafia's hand extended into construction, shipping, trucking, and entertainment. Every movement of goods and money paid tribute to the empire. What made Luciano different from every other mobster wasn't just his ambition, but his understanding of perception. He knew that brutality alone couldn't sustain power; appearance mattered. He distanced himself from the violence, surrounding himself with lawyers, accountants, and front companies. To the untrained eye, he looked like a successful businessman. He moved in high society, dined with actors, and sat ringside at boxing matches. The newspapers, even when critical, couldn't resist his charm, calling him the modern gangster, a man who combined the ruthlessness of the old world with the sophistication of the new. Psychologically, Luciano operated like a chess player who saw 10 moves ahead. Every rival, every ally, every corrupt official was part of his board. He rewarded loyalty lavishly but punished betrayal without hesitation. His power wasn't just in his guns or his money, it was in his ability to anticipate human behavior. He understood greed, fear, pride, and temptation better than most psychologists of his time. He could read a man's weakness and turn it into leverage. That was his real weapon. And yet, within his empire's perfection lay a quiet arrogance. Luciano believed he had finally created a criminal system too sophisticated to be touched by the law. The bribed cops, the silent judges, the friendly politicians, they all reinforced his illusion of invincibility. To him, the government was just another bureaucracy, one that could be bought, manipulated, or ignored. But the winds of justice were shifting. The public was growing weary of corruption. Reformers and journalists were beginning to expose the dark alliance between politics and crime. And somewhere in Manhattan, a relentless young prosecutor named Thomas Dewey was studying Luciano's empire like a surgeon examining a tumor. For now, though, Luciano remained untouchable. His control over vice was so complete that even his enemies had to pay him to operate. Every illicit dollar that moved through New York carried his invisible signature. From Times Square brothels to Harlem gambling dens, from the docks of Brooklyn to the backrooms of City Hall, all roads led back to him. Luciano had turned sin into structure, chaos into commerce. He wasn't just a gangster anymore, he was an emperor of vice, ruling an empire built not on faith or loyalty, but on the most unshakable currency of all, human desire. He had achieved the impossible, but as history would soon remind him, every empire built on desire eventually becomes its own undoing. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the height of his power. He had conquered New York's underworld, restructured organized crime, and built an empire so vast that even the law seemed powerless against him. To the outside world, he was untouchable, a figure of luxury and sophistication, his crimes hidden beneath tailored suits and expensive cologne. But in a quiet office in Manhattan, a young prosecutor was about to become his reckoning. Thomas E. Dewey was everything Luciano wasn't: disciplined, righteous, and incorruptible. Where Luciano moved in whispers and shadows, Dewey operated in the cold light of law and order. Appointed as a special prosecutor in 1935 to root out organized crime and political corruption, Dewey represented a new kind of enemy, one who couldn't be bribed, seduced, or intimidated. He saw Luciano not as a legend, but as a disease eating away at the moral foundation of America. Dewey's crusade began with a simple yet dangerous belief: no man was above the law. To dismantle Luciano's empire, he had to expose the invisible web that connected the streets to the halls of power. He started where Luciano was most vulnerable: prostitution. The business that had quietly made Luciano millions would become the weapon that brought him down. Using a network of undercover investigators and frightened witnesses, Dewey's team began infiltrating the brothels that operated under Luciano's protection. What they uncovered was staggering: a vast system of controlled vice that spanned across Manhattan, with hundreds of women working under an organized management structure. Each brothel paid tribute to Luciano's men, each transaction recorded like a legitimate enterprise. The problem wasn't proving prostitution, it was linking it directly to Luciano. The Mafia's strength had always been its distance from the dirt. Luciano never signed anything, never handled the money himself, and never appeared at the crime scenes. His brilliance was in delegation, in the layers of insulation that kept his hands clean while everyone else's dripped with guilt. But Dewey was relentless. He pressured madams, threatened lieutenants, and turned small-time pimps into state witnesses. The turning point came when several key insiders, terrified of prison or death, agreed to testify against their boss. Among them was Cokie Flo Brown, a prostitute who had once been close to Luciano's organization. Her testimony painted him not as a shadowy figure, but as the direct mastermind behind New York's prostitution network. Luciano dismissed the accusations at first, calling them fabrications, the ravings of desperate women seeking leniency. But as Dewey's case grew stronger, the empire that once seemed invincible began to tremble. His lawyers were confident, but the media frenzy surrounding the case made escape impossible. For the first time, the charming Don found himself cornered, not by gangsters or rivals, but by the power of public outrage. The trial began in May 1936 and instantly became a national spectacle. Headlines screamed of America's Vice King, and crowds lined up outside the courthouse just to catch a glimpse of Luciano. Inside, Dewey built his case methodically, step by step, showing how the brothel network connected directly to Luciano through layers of management and intimidation. Witness after witness described meetings, payments, and threats, a chain that led back to the man sitting in the defendant's chair. Luciano's defense argued that he was a victim of ambition and hysteria, that Dewey's crusade was more about headlines than justice. They painted Luciano as a businessman, not a pimp, and accused the prosecution of manipulating weak and frightened women. Yet, the sheer weight of evidence, the money trails, the testimonies, the coded communications, was too much to ignore. Throughout the trial, Luciano maintained his composure. He dressed impeccably, smiled faintly, and exuded an air of calm detachment. To observers, he seemed untouchable even then, as if the courtroom itself were just another stage for his performance of control. But behind that calm exterior, he knew the tide was turning. The world he had built, where power insulated him from consequences, was collapsing under the weight of exposure. On June 18, 1936, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. It was one of the harshest penalties ever given to an organized crime figure in American history. The newspapers called it the fall of the king. For Dewey, it was a triumph, the culmination of his vision of moral justice. For Luciano, it was the beginning of a new era, one where his empire would have to survive without him. As he was led away in handcuffs, photographers captured the moment. Lucky Luciano, once the most powerful gangster in America, walking calmly toward his cell. He didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't resist. He knew better than anyone that power isn't lost in a single blow. It's eroded slowly, piece by piece, until the empire you built stands only in memory. But Luciano was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Even behind bars, he would find a way to maintain influence, to control from the shadows. His body might have been imprisoned, but his mind remained free, calculating, waiting. Because deep down, Lucky Luciano understood something that Thomas Dewey never could. The law could cage a man, but it could never cage the system he had built. The empire would live on, silent, invisible, and patient, until the world needed it again. When the iron doors of Clinton Correctional Facility clanged shut behind Lucky Luciano in 1936, many believed that was the end of an era, that the American Mafia had lost its leader, and that justice had finally triumphed. Newspapers hailed Thomas Dewey as the man who cut the head off the serpent. Politicians congratulated themselves, promising that organized crime would soon crumble without its mastermind. But in truth, the serpent was very much alive, and its head, though confined within stone walls, was still thinking, planning, and commanding. Luciano was officially inmate number 92168, sentenced to spend up to 50 years behind bars. Yet, unlike most prisoners, he didn't vanish into obscurity. Even within the confines of Clinton, a cold, isolated fortress in upstate New York, he remained the quiet center of an invisible network. His men still operated on the outside. His lieutenants still whispered his name in respect. The empire he built had been designed to survive his absence. It was too structured, too profitable, too disciplined to collapse. Inside prison, Luciano adapted quickly. He wasn't the kind of man to waste time in bitterness. Instead, he observed, studied, and maintained an aura of calm authority. Guards noticed that other inmates treated him with deference. Even without weapons or wealth, Luciano radiated the same quiet confidence that had made him a king on the outside. He befriended prison officials, treated them respectfully, and soon gained small privileges, access to visitors, private conversations, even influence over prison assignments. But the real power lay beyond the bars. Communication between Luciano and his associates continued, carried through coded letters, visiting relatives, and corrupt intermediaries. He didn't need to issue orders directly. His loyal lieutenants like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky already knew how to interpret his silence. His empire operated like a self-sustaining machine. Luciano had built it that way, a system that didn't rely on a single man, but on a shared understanding of profit and fear. Outside the prison, the underworld continued to evolve. The commission still met, territories were still managed, and money still flowed. Luciano's imprisonment had, paradoxically, legitimized his myth. His name became legend. The fallen king, the misunderstood businessman, the man who had been punished not for murder, but for managing vice too efficiently. Within the criminal world, he became a symbol, proof that the Mafia could outlive any one of its leaders. Yet for all his influence, there was no denying the slow decay that comes with confinement. Years stretched endlessly. His health began to suffer, and his reflection in the mirror grew older, softer. He read voraciously, studied law, and occasionally granted interviews through intermediaries. Reporters found his charisma undiminished. He spoke like a philosopher, framing his imprisonment as just another phase of business. But outside those walls, America was changing. The late 1930s brought whispers of war. Europe was burning under Hitler's rise, and the United States, though still neutral, was preparing for the inevitable. For the government, the docks of New York became a vital lifeline, the arteries of supply for the nation's defense. Yet those docks were still under Mafia influence, run by the same unions Luciano's men had long controlled. It was a paradox the Navy could not ignore. The man who had once been condemned as America's greatest criminal still indirectly controlled one of its most strategic resources. When dockworkers struck, shipments halted. When rumors of espionage spread, no one could tell truth from gossip. The Mafia's control over the waterfront had survived prison walls, trials, and headlines. And the man who could still influence it, perhaps even stabilize it, was sitting in a cell in Dannemora. As the 1940s began, Luciano's isolation began to feel less like punishment and more like incubation. He had no reason to believe the government would ever need him. But deep down, he understood the one rule that had guided his entire life. Power always finds its way to relevance. The world outside was heading toward chaos, and chaos was Luciano's natural element. There are accounts, though never fully confirmed, that even during his imprisonment, Luciano kept in touch with Navy-connected intermediaries through old friends like Lansky. The underworld's tendrils reached into every institution. If the government ever needed help on the docks, it was an open secret where that help could come from. And soon that hypothetical would become a reality. In 1942, when the USS Normandy, one of the largest ships ever built, mysteriously caught fire and capsized in New York Harbor, panic swept through the nation. Theories of Nazi sabotage flooded the newspapers. The Navy realized that if foreign agents had indeed infiltrated the docks, conventional law enforcement would be powerless to root them out. They needed someone who understood the waterfront, who could command silence and obedience, someone whose name still inspired fear among dockworkers and gangsters alike. In that moment of crisis, the unthinkable began to take shape, the idea of reaching out to Lucky Luciano. Inside his prison cell, he couldn't have known it yet, but the balance of power was beginning to shift once more, this time not through violence but through necessity. The government that had put him away was about to knock on his door. Luciano's story was no longer just about crime, it was about irony. The same man condemned as a parasite of American society was about to become its most useful ally. And as history would soon reveal, even behind bars, Lucky Luciano was never truly powerless. He was simply waiting for the world to remember that every empire, even one built in darkness, can be reborn when desperation calls its name. By early 1942, the United States found itself at war, not just with foreign enemies but with fear itself. The bombing of Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of safety, and now the American homeland trembled at whispers of enemy spies, hidden saboteurs, and the unseen reach of Axis powers along its coasts. New York Harbor, the busiest port in the nation, became a critical artery for the war effort, the point through which weapons, supplies, and soldiers would flow to Europe. But beneath its surface ran something darker: corruption, black markets, and control that the government didn't fully understand. The docks were not run by the Navy, the police, or even the unions. They were run by the Mafia. Every crate that moved, every ship that docked, every laborer who touched the ropes, all operated under the silent rule of organized crime. And at the top of that invisible structure, still commanding respect even from behind prison walls, was Lucky Luciano. When the French luxury liner USS Normandy, being converted into a troopship, suddenly burst into flames on February 9, 1942, panic erupted. The ship capsized in less than 12 hours, a 1,000-foot monument to disaster now lying on its side in New York Harbor. Official reports claimed an accidental welding fire, but whispers spread faster than facts. Sabotage. German agents. Espionage on American soil. The Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence (ONI) was desperate. They needed to secure the waterfront, but the police couldn't be trusted, and the unions were riddled with mob influence. Intelligence agents had no way to infiltrate the closed world of longshoremen. Only one group truly controlled the docks, and they didn't answer to Washington. That's when Commander Charles R. Haffenden came forward with a controversial proposal: reach out to the Mafia. More specifically, reach out to the man who built the system in the first place, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. At first, the idea was unthinkable. How could the U.S. government, in the midst of war, collaborate with one of America's most notorious criminals? But pragmatism has always had its own morality. When survival is on the line, ideology bends. If the Mafia could provide intelligence, prevent sabotage, and ensure that the docks ran smoothly, then perhaps justice could make an exception, at least for now. Enter Meyer Lansky, the brain behind Luciano's financial empire and one of the few men trusted by both the underworld and elements of the U.S. government. Lansky had Jewish roots and a deep hatred for the fascist regimes rising in Europe. When naval officials discreetly approached him for help securing the docks, Lansky didn't hesitate, but he made one condition clear: to truly control the Mafia's cooperation, they would need Luciano's blessing. And so, in the spring of 1942, a secret negotiation began, one that would later be known as Operation Underworld. The meetings were held in absolute secrecy. Through a chain of intermediaries, Haffenden arranged contact with Luciano in Clinton Correctional Facility. There were no official documents, no signatures, no paper trail. The understanding was entirely verbal, sealed by trust and mutual need. Luciano agreed to help, but on one condition: protection for his associates and consideration for his future freedom. From his prison cell, Luciano began to reassert his influence. Messages moved quietly through visitors, coded letters, and intermediaries. The Mafia's control of the docks was restructured for the war effort. Gangsters who once collected protection money were now protecting national security. Dockworkers were told to report suspicious activity, shipments were safeguarded, and foreign espionage rumors began to vanish. Behind the scenes, Luciano's network extended even further, reaching into Sicily. When the Allies prepared for Operation Husky, the 1943 invasion of the Italian island, intelligence officers turned again to the underworld. They needed information on local terrain, resistance movements, and coastal defenses, things traditional spies couldn't gather. Through contacts in the Sicilian Mafia, long connected to Luciano's organization, the Americans reportedly received vital intelligence that smoothed the Allied landings. To this day, the true extent of Luciano's involvement remains debated. Some historians argue it was exaggerated, that the Navy merely sought his symbolic cooperation to calm the docks. Others insist his influence reached directly into the Sicilian campaign, shaping the very outcome of the invasion. Whatever the truth, the results were undeniable. The docks remained quiet, the sabotage stopped, and Allied ships sailed safely. For Luciano, the deal was a quiet victory, a moment of power regained through intellect rather than intimidation. He had turned his greatest punishment into leverage, transforming from prisoner to wartime asset. His cooperation had given him something priceless: relevance. And the government, for all its righteousness, had crossed a moral line it could never fully erase. They had made a shadow deal, a pact between law and crime, born from desperation. As the war dragged on, Luciano's name remained unspoken in public reports. The arrangement was so secret that even the press had no clue. Only after the war would fragments of the story begin to surface, whispered among journalists and former agents. In 1945, as the Allies celebrated victory, Luciano waited patiently. He had kept his word, the docks had remained free of sabotage, and the Mafia had done its part to protect the nation's supply chain. Now it was time for the government to return the favor. The question was no longer whether Lucky Luciano had helped the United States. The question was, what was the price of that help? That answer, when it came, would change everything. Because for the first time in American history, the lines between criminal and patriot had blurred completely. And standing in the middle of that moral fog was Lucky Luciano, the man who had turned treason into service, corruption into strategy, and captivity into. By 1945, the war was ending, and the United States was standing on the ashes of a world remade by violence and victory. While cities in Europe lay in ruin, America celebrated triumph. Factories roared back to life, soldiers returned home, and the newspapers declared the dawn of a new era. But behind that patriotic glow, a quiet transaction was unfolding in the shadows, one that would test the very definition of justice. Charles Lucky Luciano had kept his part of the unspoken deal. During the war, his influence had stabilized the docks, prevented further sabotage, and perhaps even aided the Allied invasion of Sicily. The Mafia's iron grip on the New York waterfront had turned from a national liability into a covert asset. And the man who orchestrated it all, from within a prison cell, had proven that his power transcended bars, guards, and law. Now it was time for the other side to deliver. Luciano's attorneys, working quietly behind the scenes, began petitioning for clemency. The argument was simple, if uncomfortable: Luciano had aided the U.S. war effort and deserved recognition. Officially, there were no documents confirming his role. The Navy's Operation Underworld remained top secret, but enough insiders within the intelligence and naval communities quietly vouched for his cooperation. In early 1945, Thomas Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted Luciano 9 years earlier, now sat in the governor's office of New York. Dewey's career had soared on the back of Luciano's conviction, and his public reputation as the nation's crime buster was unmatched. But now, the weight of quiet persuasion pressed against his conscience. Navy officials, intelligence officers, and political intermediaries all hinted that Dewey's old adversary had, in fact, helped win the war. Dewey faced a moral paradox. Granting clemency to Luciano would stain his legacy. It would look like he was forgiving a criminal he'd once sworn to destroy. But denying it risked exposing the government's wartime hypocrisy, that America had leaned on the very criminal it condemned. It was a test of ideology versus pragmatism. And in the end, pragmatism won. On January 3, 1946, Governor Thomas Dewey quietly signed an order commuting Lucky Luciano's sentence. The official statement acknowledged Luciano's services rendered to the Navy during the war, though the specifics were left deliberately vague. The condition was clear. Luciano would be released from prison, but deported permanently to Italy. The news exploded like dynamite. Headlines blazed: Lucky Luciano freed, to be deported at once. To the public it was unthinkable. The man once branded America's vice king was walking free after serving only 10 years of a 50-year sentence. Politicians demanded answers, reporters demanded documents. But there were none. The deal had been made in whispers, and the evidence had been buried under the weight of national secrecy. Luciano himself maintained a cool, almost detached demeanor. When reporters shouted questions as he was escorted to Ellis Island for processing, he gave only a faint smile and said, "I did what I had to do for this country. Now I'll take what's mine." He boarded the SS Laura Keene under heavy guard and sailed for Naples, leaving behind the city that had made him both a king and a prisoner. As the Manhattan skyline disappeared over the horizon, he lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and said to one of his escorts, "They think I'm gone. But New York never leaves me." Freedom had a cost, and Luciano knew it. His empire in America was no longer his to command directly. The commission had evolved, the younger dons were rising, and new powers were reshaping the underworld. But even from exile he intended to reclaim a measure of control. He had traded prison for distance, and in the world of crime distance was never permanent. In Naples, Luciano was greeted like a folk hero. The Italian press called him il re del crimen, the king of crime. He settled into a comfortable villa, dressed elegantly as ever, and resumed the lifestyle of a man who had never truly surrendered. But beneath the surface he was restless. He was a man without a city, free yet displaced, powerful yet haunted by irrelevance. Meanwhile, back in America, whispers spread through the underworld that Lucky was back in play. His lieutenants, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis and others, still held influence in the commission. Even from across the Atlantic, Luciano's name carried weight. Orders, suggestions and alliances began to pass through coded messages, couriers and visitors. The irony was perfect. The U.S. government had freed Luciano to rid itself of a problem, but in doing so they had given him new legitimacy. He was no longer just a criminal, he was a man who had helped America win a war. To his followers that made him untouchable, a living legend. But history never lets men like Lucky Luciano rest for long. The deal that had bought his freedom also marked the beginning of his exile, a gilded cage far from the city that defined him. In Italy he would build new networks, dream of returning, and attempt to reinvent his empire from afar. Yet deep down he knew the truth. He would never again walk the streets of Manhattan as its undisputed king. His empire had changed hands, his city had moved on, and his power, though still formidable, was now a ghostly echo of what once was. Still, the name Lucky Luciano carried an unshakable power. He had outplayed the law, outlasted his enemies and rewritten the rules of survival. From street hustler to crime architect, from prisoner to secret ally of the state, he had lived a life that blurred the line between sin and necessity. The world had changed, but the game he created, still bore his fingerprints. And as he settled into exile, Lucky Luciano wasn't finished yet. Because freedom, to a man like him, was never about place or pardon. It was about control. And in the shadows of post-war Italy, he was already plotting how to take it back. Naples, 1946. The Mediterranean sun shone over a nation still scarred by war, bombed-out buildings, black market deals, and a new underworld rising from the ruins. And into this fractured world stepped Charles Lucky Luciano, the man America had exiled yet could never fully escape. When Luciano disembarked from the SS Laura Keene, he was met not as a criminal, but as a celebrity. In Italy, where power and corruption often walked hand in hand, he was treated with fascination and grudging respect. Reporters wrote of the American gangster who tamed New York, and whispers spread through Naples' cafes and back alleys that the legendary Don had returned to reclaim his crown. But beneath the charm and the smiles, Luciano felt hollow. For the first time in his adult life he was truly displaced, an emperor without an empire. His kingdom was still in New York, controlled by men he once mentored. Frank Costello, the smooth political operator, Vito Genovese, cunning and ambitious, Meyer Lansky, ever the strategist, managing global finances from the shadows. Each of them owed something to Lucky, yet each had also grown powerful enough to no longer need him. Luciano had traded a prison cell for an open-air exile, freedom that felt like isolation. Still, he was not a man to fade into obscurity. Within months of settling in Naples, he began rebuilding what he called his connections of trust. He re-established contacts with Mafia families in Palermo, Rome, and Sicily, forming a loose confederation of loyalty that stretched across the Atlantic. From his elegant home overlooking the Bay of Naples, Luciano conducted quiet meetings with smugglers, black market brokers, and exiled gangsters. Post-war Europe was a breeding ground for opportunity, chaos meant profit, and Lucky had always known how to turn disorder into advantage. One of his first ventures was the international narcotics trade. During the war, the drug market had gone dormant, but now demand surged. Luciano saw what others didn't. The new global map was a gift. From Turkey came the opium. From Marseille, it was refined into heroin. From Italy, it could be shipped to Cuba and New York through old smuggling routes. With his contacts in both Europe and America, Luciano quietly positioned himself as a silent architect of what would later become the French Connection. He never got his hands dirty, not directly. He operated through middlemen, old associates, and coded communications. His empire was no longer visible, but it was no less real. The money flowed, the routes expanded, and Luciano proved once again that his genius was not in violence, but in organization. He understood the criminal world like a machine, If you oil the right gears, it keeps turning forever. Yet even as he built this new shadowy empire, Luciano lived with a constant ache, the loss of New York. He would often sit on his balcony at night, overlooking the lights of Naples, a glass of Chianti in his hand, and tell visitors stories about back home. About Broadway. About Fifth Avenue. About the clubs he once owned, the politicians he once bribed, the city that once whispered his name with both fear and admiration. He missed the sound of it, the rhythm of New York. But across the Atlantic, the Mafia was changing. The post-war boom brought new faces, new money, and new ways of doing business. Frank Costello had become a respected figure in high society, blending crime with politics. Vito Genovese, however, had returned from Italy with ambition and venom, eager to reclaim control and eliminate his old mentor's allies. The commission Luciano had built to ensure peace was now fracturing under greed and paranoia. Luciano tried to mediate from afar, sending messages and emissaries, but his voice carried less weight with each passing year. The new generation saw him as a relic, the founder, yes, but no longer the master. Power had moved on. Still, Lucky Luciano's legend continued to grow. He remained untouchable, a ghost in the system. Even when the Italian authorities placed him under surveillance, they could never pin a crime directly to him. The Americans, too, kept watch, nervous that he might be orchestrating something bigger. Both governments saw him as dangerous, not because of what he did but because of what he could do. Then, in the late 1940s, Luciano's name surfaced again in the world of Cuban casinos. Meyer Lansky had begun turning Havana into a playground for the American elite. Glamorous resorts, high-stakes gambling, and luxury beyond imagination. Luciano, always nostalgic for the thrill of business, wanted in. Despite his deportation, he secretly traveled to Cuba in 1946 under a false passport. It was a reunion of the old syndicate, Lansky, Costello, and the rest, held at the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, the Caribbean's most opulent resort. There, amid cigars and rum, Luciano presided over meetings like a returning monarch. The Havana Conference of 1946 became legendary in underworld lore, a symbolic board meeting of the American Mafia. For a brief moment, Lucky was back on his throne. But the dream was short-lived. When the U.S. government discovered Luciano's presence in Cuba, it exerted heavy diplomatic pressure on Havana. Within months he was arrested and deported once again, back to Italy under strict surveillance. The message was clear. Luciano might still be a legend, but he was not welcome anywhere he once ruled. The rest of his life became a paradox, one part exile, one part empire. He grew older, softer, more reflective. He gave interviews to journalists, offering cryptic comments about morality, loyalty, and business. "I never killed a man who didn't deserve it," he once said. "And I never broke a deal I made." He spent his days in semi-retirement, surrounded by a small circle of loyal friends and admirers. Yet his influence endured. Every major mafia decision in the late 1940s and early 1950s still echoed his structure, his philosophy. The commission remained the heart of organized crime, and its pulse beat to the rhythm Lucky Luciano had written decades earlier. But as the world modernized, Luciano began to feel time closing in. Television replaced jazz clubs. Politicians became slicker, the mafia more corporate. And Lucky, the man who once ruled the shadows, found himself watching his empire evolve without him. Still, even in exile, he had accomplished what no gangster before or after could. He had built an empire so efficient, so self-sustaining, that it survived the fall of its creator. His story was no longer just about crime. It was about legacy, the strange immortality that comes from mastering the balance between power and consequence. And though he would die far from New York, the city he built, its criminal architecture, its invisible laws, its moral ambiguities, would forever bear his fingerprints. In exile, Lucky Luciano had found a new kind of kingdom, one without borders, one ruled not by fear but by memory. Because even oceans couldn't drown the myth of a man who had once made the. By the 1950s, Lucky Luciano was no longer the ruthless young visionary who once ruled New York from the shadows. The world around him had changed, the music, the money, even the crime. But Luciano remained what he had always been, a man impossible to forget, a myth too powerful to die quietly. He lived in Naples now, under near-constant police watch, a living contradiction, part exile, part legend. His villa overlooked the sea, calm and blue, but within him there was no peace. Decades of power had left him restless. The man who had once built the Mafia into a modern empire couldn't simply fade into anonymity. He still entertained visitors, old associates, journalists, curious admirers, and every meeting carried the aura of an audience with a king in exile. Luciano had grown reflective, even philosophical. To those who listened, he spoke about the Mafia not as a criminal organization, but as a misunderstood system, a way of surviving in a corrupt world. In America, he told one interviewer, the government had its laws and we had ours. The difference is we kept ours. But nostalgia was a dangerous companion. For every memory that brought pride, there was another that haunted him. He often spoke of Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masuria, the men he had ordered killed to unite the Mafia. I did what I had to do, he would say, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. It was business, but you never stopped seeing their faces. Despite his reflective mood, Luciano wasn't done making moves. Even in exile, he remained connected to the criminal networks he had helped design. His name was still respected in New York, Havana, and Marseille. When narcotics trafficking began to expand into a global enterprise, many investigators traced its roots back to his post-war networks. The French Connection, smuggling heroin from Europe to America, was in many ways built on foundations Luciano had quietly laid years earlier. He never admitted involvement, at least not directly. But every law enforcement agency on both sides of the Atlantic suspected he remained the invisible architect. He had learned long ago that true power was not in being seen, but in being remembered. Luciano also remained a figure of fascination for the press. Hollywood producers wanted to adapt his story. Authors wrote books about his life, half fact and half myth. To many, he represented the American dream turned inside out. A poor Sicilian boy who climbed from nothing to build an empire, only to lose it all to ambition and fate. By the mid-1950s, he seemed to sense that his time was drawing to a close. His health was declining, years of stress, imprisonment and smoking had taken their toll. Yet he continued to host dinners, to tell stories of a world that no longer existed. In his voice there was pride but also melancholy, the knowledge that he had changed the world but not himself. One of his closest friends later recalled that Luciano often spoke about returning to New York, even if only for a day. I just want to walk down Mulberry Street again, he said once, smell the bakeries, hear the kids yelling, feel like I belong somewhere. But that dream would remain unfulfilled. The U.S. government had made it clear. If Lucky Luciano ever set foot on American soil again, he'd be arrested immediately. In his final years, Luciano found himself drawn to reflection, not on power but on mortality. He read books on philosophy and religion, though he claimed never to believe in redemption. You can't wash blood off your soul, he once said. You just learn to live with the stains. Then, in 1962, the final chapter of his story began. A Hollywood producer named Martin Gosch approached Luciano with a proposal, a film about his life. At first, Lucky laughed. Who's gonna play me? Clark Gable? He joked. But he agreed to cooperate, perhaps seeing in the project a chance to tell his side of the story, to shape his own myth before others finished it for him. For months, Luciano met with Gosch, recounting stories from his youth, his rise, his empire. The sessions were filled with wit, candor, and surprising self-awareness. I wasn't proud of everything I did, he admitted, but I built something that lasted. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at Naples airport to meet Gosch one final time and finalize the film deal. He dressed immaculately as always, a tailored gray suit, polished shoes, a silk tie. To the world he was still Lucky Luciano, the man who made crime look elegant. The meeting went smoothly, the conversation light. When it ended, Luciano walked with Gosch toward the parking lot, laughing about a scene they just discussed. Then suddenly he stopped mid-step. His hand went to his chest. The smile vanished. Within seconds, Lucky Luciano collapsed to the ground, struck by a massive heart attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. Just like that, no courtroom, no gunfire, no betrayal. The man who had built the American Mafia died on a quiet afternoon in Italy, far from the city that had made him immortal. News of his death spread quickly. In New York, the underworld fell silent for a moment of respect. Old gangsters raised glasses in his honor. Even his enemies acknowledged what he had been, not just a criminal but a visionary. The Italian authorities, wary of his legend, refused to let his death become a public spectacle. Yet even in death, Luciano found his way home. After a series of appeals, his body was transported to the United States. Thousands attended his funeral in New York. Former associates, curious onlookers, and even police officers watched as the man who had once ruled the city was finally laid to rest in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, the same resting place as many of the men who had followed him, fought him, or died because of him. As the coffin was lowered, A priest murmured prayers over the grave. Among the crowd, someone whispered, "Lucky finally made it back to New York." He had. In the end, death gave him what life had denied him, a return to the city that defined him. And as the mourners drifted away, one truth lingered in the air. Lucky Luciano had not just built an empire of crime, he had built a blueprint for power itself. Even decades after his death, his fingerprints remained on the systems he created, the hierarchies, the rules, the silence. His commission still shaped the Mafia. His philosophy, that crime like business could be organized, had changed the underworld forever. He had lived as a criminal, died as a legend, and left behind something greater than both. A legacy that blurred the line between order and chaos, law and loyalty, power and morality. Because in the end, Lucky Luciano was never just a man. He was the idea that control, true lasting control, could be built from the shadows. When Lucky Luciano's coffin was lowered into the ground at St. John's Cemetery in 1962, many believed it was the final chapter of a criminal story, the end of a man who had corrupted cities, bought politicians and rewritten the rules of organized crime. But in truth, it was only the beginning of his legend. Because what Luciano left behind wasn't just an empire of money and violence, it was a system. A philosophy of power so enduring that it outlived every man who ever tried to destroy it. For the Mafia, Luciano's death wasn't a loss, it was a foundation. He had built something far greater than a gang, he had built a structure. The Commission, his brainchild from the 1930s, remained the invisible parliament of organized crime in America. It balanced territories, settled disputes, and regulated business like a corporate boardroom. Even decades later, long after his death, every major Mafia decision in New York, Chicago, and beyond was made in the shadow of Lucky Luciano's design. Luciano had understood something few gangsters ever grasped. Violence alone doesn't sustain power, order does. He transformed chaos into hierarchy, crime into enterprise. His syndicate didn't just smuggle and kill, it negotiated, invested, and reinvested. He replaced the old world's bloody feuds with a modern, business-like approach to control. That was his true genius, not brutality but organization. Long after his exile, his name became a metaphor for a certain kind of power. Silent, calculating, efficient. Politicians studied his methods. Corporations mirrored his structure. The idea that power could be decentralized yet unified, that loyalty could replace law, was something Luciano had understood instinctively. He wasn't educated, but he was brilliant in the language of survival. Even law enforcement, his eternal enemy, learned from him. The FBI's later strategies for dismantling the Mafia, using surveillance, wiretaps, and the RICO Act, were direct responses to Luciano's innovations. It took decades and an entire generation of prosecutors to undo what he had built with instinct and charisma. But beyond the mechanics of crime, Luciano's legacy was psychological. He embodied the duality of the American dream, the idea that anyone could rise from nothing, but that ambition often comes with a moral price. Born in poverty in Sicily, raised in the slums of New York's Lower East Side, Luciano had seen early that power wasn't given, it was taken. The system didn't reward fairness, it rewarded cunning. That truth became the foundation of his worldview. In his mind he was never a villain, he was a realist. In America, he once said, there are two governments, one visible and one invisible. To Luciano he simply chose the invisible one. Even in exile that belief echoed. He often told younger men who came to visit him in Naples, "You can't rule by fear alone, you rule by making people need you." It was a lesson that transcended crime. It was politics, business and psychology all at once. Historians and criminologists later debated whether Luciano's so-called service to the government during World War II was a moral contradiction or a pragmatic alliance. But to Lucky it had never been either. It was business. The Mafia, like any power structure, was simply a reflection of society's own contradictions. Governments used criminals when it suited them, and condemned them when it didn't. Luciano had merely played that game better than anyone else. In death, his myth only deepened. Films and novels began to romanticize his world. The Godfather, Goodfellas, Boardwalk Empire, all drew from the empire he created. The archetype of the gentleman gangster, the strategist who combined ruthlessness with restraint, came directly from him. Before Lucky Luciano, the mobster was a thug. After him, he was a CEO. But for all the glamour, there was always a darker truth behind his legacy, the cost of that empire. Thousands of lives were destroyed in the system he built. Addiction, extortion, violence, all hidden behind the veneer of order and sophistication. Luciano's genius had made the Mafia more efficient, but also more insidious. It wasn't just killing people, it was managing society's vices. And yet, history has a strange relationship with men like him. Over time their crimes fade and their systems remain. Lucky Luciano had become less of a criminal and more of a symbol, of power without morality, of order without justice. His influence wasn't confined to the Mafia, it seeped into the very culture of ambition. The idea that success is about control, not virtue, that's Luciano's truest legacy. In the decades that followed his death, the world saw reflections of his structure everywhere. Drug cartels in Mexico, triads in Hong Kong, Yakuza syndicates in Japan, all adopted Luciano's principles of hierarchy, loyalty, and cooperation over chaos. Even in corporate boardrooms, his ghost lingered, in the quiet deals, the unspoken alliances, the art of controlling without being seen. To this day the name Lucky Luciano carries weight, not as a relic of the past but as a lesson in the anatomy of power. He was both admired and despised, a man who represented everything seductive and terrifying about control. The irony is that Luciano never saw himself as lucky. Luck, he once said, is for suckers. You make your own breaks. And he had, from a tenement street kid to a global crime architect, from prisoner to wartime collaborator, from exile to legend. His entire life had been a study in survival, in bending systems that were meant to break men like him. Today when historians talk about him, they don't just speak of crimes. They speak of structure, of psychology, of innovation. He turned the Mafia from a weapon into an institution, one that governments, corporations, and even enemies would eventually mirror. His story is not just about the rise of organized crime. It's about the nature of power itself. Because Lucky Luciano's greatest creation wasn't the Mafia, it was the idea that the world runs on quiet deals. That behind every visible act of authority, there is a shadow network pulling the strings. And that, perhaps, was the most enduring lesson of all. Power doesn't disappear. It adapts. It wears new suits, speaks new languages, but the structure, Luciano's structure, remains. In that sense, Lucky Luciano never truly died. He simply stepped deeper into the shadows he had always ruled. Time has a strange way of polishing monsters into myths. And in the decades since his death, Lucky Luciano has become more than a name. He has become a mirror reflecting both the brilliance and the corruption of the world that made him. To understand him now, from the safety of history, is to confront a question that still unsettles. Was Lucky Luciano a criminal genius, or simply a product of a broken system that rewarded power over principle? The truth, as with all legends, lies somewhere in between. When people today speak of Luciano, they often speak in tones of fascination. The elegance, the cunning, the style. They recall the immaculate suits, the calm smile, the soft-spoken authority that made even enemies lower their eyes. But that image, however cinematic, hides the brutality beneath it. Behind the smooth talker who made deals with politicians and generals was a man who had ordered murders with the same detachment he used to sign contracts. Yet perhaps that contradiction, that seamless blend of civility and savagery, is precisely what made him unforgettable. He embodied a truth most people spend their lives avoiding, that morality and power rarely coexist peacefully. Luciano didn't just exploit that truth, he lived it, shaped it, and left it behind as a philosophy. In the years following his death, writers, filmmakers, and historians all tried to define him. Some saw him as a necessary evil, a man who gave structure to chaos. Others saw him as the ultimate corrupter, the man who taught America that crime could wear a suit. But no matter how he was portrayed, one thing remained certain. He had changed the very language of power. Before Luciano, organized crime was an ethnic battlefield. Sicilians against Irish, Italians against Jews, chaos against chaos. After him, it became an organization built on structure, negotiation, and profit. His model outlasted Prohibition, survived the Great Depression, and adapted to the Cold War. The Mafia of the mid-20th century, from Vito Genovese to Carlo Gambino, all operated under Luciano's blueprint. Even outside the underworld, traces of his thinking can be found. His approach to loyalty, management, and silence, the Code of Omerta, would influence everything from intelligence agencies to political machines. Luciano understood something the world is still learning, that information and silence are both weapons, and that control is not about what you say but what you withhold. Psychologically, Luciano's legacy invites a deeper question about the nature of leadership itself. He ruled without speeches or ideologies. He didn't need to inspire, only to be indispensable. His subordinates didn't follow him out of love or fear, but because he made their survival depend on his success. In that sense, he created not just a criminal empire, but a psychological ecosystem, one that replicated itself across continents, decades, and generations. And yet, beneath the grandeur of that empire, there was always a man. A boy from Lurkra, Sicily, who had once crossed an ocean with nothing but a dream and a defiant will to never be powerless again. His childhood poverty, the immigrant slurs, the gang beatings, all of it carved into him a lesson he never forgot. The world doesn't give, it takes. So he learned to take first. That is perhaps why his story resonates far beyond crime documentaries or history books. It's not just about gangsters and deals, it's about the psychology of ambition, the cost of becoming someone in a world built to keep you invisible. Lucky Luciano's story isn't just about sin, it's about survival. Still, there's a tragic poetry in how his life ended, alone in exile, surrounded by luxury but haunted by ghosts. The empire he built had outgrown him, and the rules he created had become laws for men who no longer remembered his face. He was the architect who watched his creation become a religion, one that worshipped money, loyalty, and silence above all else. And maybe that's the truest irony of Lucky Luciano's life. He wanted power to make himself untouchable, yet it was that very power that isolated him from everything human. Love, friendship, peace, all sacrificed for control. The man who could command armies with a glance died on a quiet airport pavement, clutching his chest, with no one left to save him. But even in that lonely death, his myth began to grow. Hollywood turned him into a character. Crime historians turned him into a case study. The Mafia turned him into a saint of strategy. And every time a new generation rediscovers him, they're seduced by the same paradox. A criminal who acted like a king, a villain who understood order better than the law itself. In truth, the man and the myth were never separate. Charles Lucky Luciano was both, the ruthless operator and the visionary reformer, the man who killed to create peace, who betrayed to build loyalty, who broke laws to create his own. He was the perfect symbol of a century obsessed with power. A century that worshipped men who could impose their will on the world, no matter the cost. If you look closely, you'll see his fingerprints everywhere. In the backroom deals, the political bargains, the invisible hands that still guide nations and corporations. Luciano understood something timeless. That control isn't about strength, but about structure. That real power doesn't roar, it whispers. And maybe that's why, decades later, we're still talking about him. Because in a world that still runs on secret deals and quiet loyalties, Lucky Luciano isn't history. He's prophecy. As the camera fades, imagine his voice, calm, composed, somewhere between pride and melancholy, echoing through time. I didn't invent the Mafia. I just gave it rules. And perhaps that's how we should remember him. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a mirror to the human hunger for order, control, and immortality. Because in the end, Lucky Luciano's greatest trick was not surviving the streets, the cops, or even exile. It was surviving history itself. He didn't just build an empire, he became the blueprint. As the final reel of Lucky Luciano's story plays out, one can almost hear the slow fade of a jazz saxophone in a smoky New York bar, that timeless sound of ambition, danger, and restless energy. It's not just the end of a man's life, but the closing of an era, the moment when the underworld took off its hat to the past and stepped into the future that he, more than anyone, had built. Charles Lucky Luciano. The name still carries weight, half-whispered and half-worshipped, as though to say it aloud is to summon the ghost of organized crime's golden age. His empire of vice, his genius for structure, his uncanny understanding of human weakness, all of it still echoes through the corridors of power, both legal and illicit. But to understand why his story endures, we have to look beyond the gunfire, the glamour, the headlines. What makes Luciano's story timeless isn't his crimes, it's his psychology. He wasn't simply a gangster. He was a philosopher of control, a man who looked at the chaos of the streets and saw not violence, but potential, a map waiting to be drawn. He saw power for what it truly was, the art of invisibility. Luciano never ruled by being the loudest man in the room. He ruled by being the one no one could read, the man who understood that every system, from governments to crime families, runs on the same fragile currency, trust and fear perfectly balanced. And he mastered both. When he reorganized the Mafia into the Commission, he didn't just solve a gang war, he created an invisible democracy, a government of criminals that operated with more discipline than many nations. He turned killers into businessmen, racketeers into strategists, and himself into something even rarer, a criminal statesman. Yet that brilliance came at a cost. Luciano's empire, like all empires, was built on blood and silence. Behind every elegant strategy was a body, a betrayal, a sacrifice. Every handshake had a shadow. Every deal came with a price. And that duality, that collision between order and destruction, became the essence of his legacy. Luciano's life reminds us that power at its core is never clean. It demands pieces of the soul in exchange for control. He once told an associate, "You can't be half a gangster." It was his creed, and his curse. In a world built on deceit, he could never truly trust, never truly love, never truly rest. But perhaps that's why his story fascinates us still. Because Lucky Luciano wasn't just a criminal. He was a reflection of something deeply human. The hunger to rise above one's station, to bend fate through sheer will, to control the uncontrollable. He represents the eternal question: how far would you go to never be powerless again? His alliances with the U.S. government during World War II, helping protect New York's docks from sabotage and aiding intelligence in Sicily, blur the moral line even further. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was an illustration of how morality itself bends before necessity. Luciano didn't just make deals with gangsters, he made deals with nations. He proved that even the so-called legitimate world speaks the same language of quiet compromise and unspoken debt. Today we live in a world Luciano might recognize, where influence often hides behind respectability, where corruption wears tailored suits, where the true power brokers rarely stand in the spotlight. His methods, stripped of their violence, have been absorbed into modern systems. Corporate hierarchies, political machines, covert operations. The structures he built in the shadows are now visible everywhere, just cleaner, subtler, and infinitely more accepted. But amid all this, there remains something profoundly tragic about him. For all his brilliance, Luciano died alone, exiled, and restless. A man surrounded by luxury but haunted by ghosts of those he used and lost. The boy who wanted control over his fate had achieved it, but the man he became discovered the emptiness that control brings. The cost of his success was isolation. There's an almost Shakespearean quality to his ending: the rise, the power, the exile, the lonely death. A man who once held America's underworld in his hands, lying cold on an airport pavement, his last words never recorded. No gunfire. No betrayal. Just silence, the kind of silence he once used to command others. And maybe that's fitting. Luciano didn't need a dramatic ending. His real drama was the world he left behind, the machine of ambition and corruption that still runs on his design. His legacy doesn't live in tombstones or police files. It lives in systems, in methods, in the very way we think about power. If you strip away the crime, the blood, the legend, you're left with a blueprint for control that is chillingly modern. His genius wasn't in breaking the law. It was in understanding that every system, even the lawful ones, has its price. So when we remember Lucky Luciano, we remember not the gangster but the architect. The man who took chaos and made it profitable, who took fear and made it currency, who took ambition and made it immortal. As the final image fades, the New York skyline glowing in twilight, the docks quiet, the city alive with whispers, a voice seems to linger in the darkness, calm and certain, like an echo from another time. The world runs on deals, kid. Always has, always will. And maybe that's the truth Luciano left behind. That power doesn't vanish, it just changes hands. That every empire, no matter how hidden, begins with a man willing to rewrite the rules. Lucky Luciano rewrote them all. And though his body lies still in Queens, the empire he imagined, the empire of quiet control, still breathes in every shadow, in every deal, in every silence where power hides its face. The man who once ruled the underworld didn't just build an empire. He built a way the world would forever move.